Hey, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Page to Production Essential Screen Skills Week 8, which is montage editing. So, in the next 2 weeks, we talk about different styles of editing. This week, we talk about the montage style, and next week, we talk about the continuity style, similar to what we see in a lot of Hollywood blockbusters. But montage was more of a, rather than continuity, it's more of a creating meaning with the type of cut you put together rather than just flowing on from one shot to the other. So I've also marked your assignments so you can view mark sheets in the MySEU site, and I hope you're all underway with early production or the final stages of pre-production of your program. So we're going to talk about different types of montage editing. We're going to start with the Soviet school. So montage editing started at the turn of the 20th century, and you can see a whole heap of guys there. So we've got Kuleshov, we've got Eisenstein, we've got Budovkin and Vertov here that we're going to talk about. And these are the early people that started a school where montage editing became really important. Now I've got a whole heap of clips there for you. So part of this watching videos online is that I'll provide you details on where to go and where to watch different things. And rather than me talking about each one and showing you each one, I'll direct you there and you can watch ones that you have interest in. So there's a couple of really good ones that I'm going to show you now. So the Kuleshov effect, this first clip here, and I've actually just haven't put them in there as hyperlinks. I've actually put them there so you can see where they're going, because this one here is the original Kuleshov effect. And if you watch it, you know the YouTube site says creepy, creepy, creepy. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to you, except that it's meant to just explain to you that with one shot can have different meaning depending on what the next shot is. So what I've done is I found another one on the Kuleshov effect which explains it, and it's a really nice, easy, simple to understand YouTube clip, and then I'll go back and show you this original one. This one explains it much better for you, and it gives you examples. So we'll watch this one first. It's about 12 minutes, I think, but it's actually excellent, and it gives you a breakdown of montage editing and the Soviet school, and this sort of Kuleshov effect, Eisenstein, Budovkin, and Vertov. And I've put all the clips there for you to have a look at, so they're a really good way to get an idea of things. Now, montage editing, you probably where it's used mainly today, sort of where you're cutting a lot of images together to create some sort of meaning. So maybe a video clip, a trailer, something like that, rather than narrative where you're driving the narrative through the editing. So let's have a look at this clip here. I think it's the best one, and then we'll go back and I'll show you a few other things as well about our tutorials. Sorry guys, lots of ads, but you know that's the world we're in. Let's skip the ad.
Let's cover some theory.
I'll make this
the
nice and big.
Kuleshov effect. A quick bit of vocabulary. Throughout this, when we're bringing up examples, we're going to be talking about the editor, and we're going to be using this title in the abstract, in the same way that we do when we're discussing the author. We're not necessarily talking about the individual who does the editing, as much as we're talking about the concept of the person who does the editing, because in reality it might be several people or it might be one. And here's a link if you want to know more about that. Also, our examples are going to be taken mostly from 10 Cloverfield Lane, a 2016 film with pretty solid editing all around.
And his stumbling around isn't helping anything. What you heard earlier was him knocking over a shelf with a whole week's worth of food, which he's sorry for, correct?
So look at the eye line here.
Let's go.
So, Lev Kuleshov was a Soviet filmmaker in the early 20th century, but really, he was a theoretician. He made movies, but he was more interested in the ideas of how movies worked, in particular the psychological mechanics of editing. Now, if you go and read up on this, you're going to see the word montage a lot, so I think this is a good moment to maybe clear this up. The thing to keep in mind is that this was literally a century ago. The roots of modern film theory largely originated in France in the 19-teens, so the first waves of film theory in America, England, Germany, and the Soviet Union heavily borrow the French vocabulary. French writers differentiated editing into two concepts: couper, or cutting, the mechanical process of putting the film together, and monter, the creative act of editing, of which the end product is montage. So, while modern English theory uses the word montage to describe a specific kind of sequence, where a series of mostly discontinuous clips are shown in fairly rapid succession, the early use of the word montage refers to what we would today simply consider editing. This is important to keep in mind because if you're reading old theory, it's easy to trick yourself into thinking that the theories only apply to what we call a montage, but really these ideas apply to all editing. So in the early 1920s, Kuleshov is teaching at the Soviet National Film School, and he's telling his students, he's writing that the soul of cinema is in the edit. It's in the way that two shots interact. In fact, he argues that acting itself can be completely suborned by editing. It is not the actor that matters, it is the cut. More meaning, he says, is created by the interaction of two shots than by any shot in isolation. To demonstrate this, he puts together a famous editing exercise. An actor sits and stares at the camera with a blank expression.
So this is the Kuleshov effect that we're going to show you about. This guy's recreated it, and I'll show you the original after this.
This shot is then intercut with a number of other images: war footage, a hot meal, children playing, and so on. The perception on the part of the audience is that the face takes on the implications of reaction, the neutral expression looking sad or hungry or worried, in turn following the war, food, and child. The meaning is created not from either the A shot or the B shot. It is created from the juxtaposition of the two. Because there's a couple of things going on here. First is the idea of eyeline. This is another thing that we addressed briefly in Suicide Squad, the instinct to follow someone's eyeline, that if someone on screen is looking somewhere and we cut away, it is assumed that the B shot is the thing that they are looking at, even if A and B aren't factually anywhere near each other. A character looks somewhere in the A shot, we assume the B shot is what they were looking at. The second is the idea of meaning, or what it means when we say meaning. The instinct is to assume that it's a deeper metaphorical kind of meaning, that we're saying theme and value are created by the interaction of two shots. And while that is true, metaphor is created by the interaction between shots, it's also a lot more mundane. It's the kind of thing you're not even thinking about. Let's look at that Cloverfield shot again. The meaning that's created is that these two shots are in the same space. The meaning is a better understanding of the geography of that space. The meaning is, this is what Michelle is seeing. The very next cut is to a close-up of the slaughtered pigs. Even though this is not contiguous with Michelle's actual field of vision, it is not a literal point-of-view shot because human eyes don't have a zoom function, it is emotionally contiguous. By cutting from far to close, the editor is saying that this is important. They are highlighting the emotional impact, the sense that a shocking thing seems to consume our focus. Then, Kuleshov effect in full force, the editor cuts back to Michelle for her reaction. A shot, B shot. The simple fact that we are even able to describe this as a reaction shot is owed to this psychological phenomenon. This forms the logic behind the rules and dialect of film editing, the shot-reverse shot of dialogue, the progression from establishing shots inward to close-ups, the preservation of screen direction through travel, and so on. Because this meaning becomes inherent to the sequence, a careful consideration of placement, order, and timing is necessary to both create desired meaning and to avoid undesired meaning. Now, what do I mean by undesired meaning? Well, mistakes, mostly. Confusion is a kind of meaning, in the same way that incomprehensible noise is still an audio signal. This is actually an important paradigm shift in the way that you look at editing. A bad edit, Suicide Squad, isn't generally bad because of some inherent mechanical failure. It's bad because it creates undesired meaning. It creates confusion when confusion wasn't intended. This car crash is confusing because it's supposed to be confusing. You're supposed to get disoriented. It's emotionally and narratively appropriate. Thus, the confusion becomes an aesthetic choice rather than a mistake. Now, one of the things that I do need to bring up. I've recreated Kuleshov's demonstration here, but you're probably thinking to yourself that it doesn't work nearly as well as I'm insisting that it does, and there's a couple reasons for that. First is that you, as a viewer, have grown up your entire life watching movies and television. The language of film, the language of continuity editing, is very natural to you. You You are used to quickly picking up on the visual cues of environment, so discontinuous location is more likely to trip you up. Second is resolution. I'm showing you these images in full color, high definition, where Kuleshov's original experiment would have looked a lot more like this. This lower resolution is important because it taps into another related idea, which is closure. Now, this is a subject all its own, but the core is that the more iconic or cartooned something is, the easier it is to accept discontinuities or unrealities. Now, to wrap this up, I do want to throw in some caveats. The edit is the final interpretive stage in creating a movie, in building its meaning before it is handed over to the audience, and owing to that position, it is so powerful in its ability to reshape meaning that all the prior stages, writing and performance, reposition themselves to accommodate. Things are written and performed with an eye towards the edit. Kuleshov was being purposefully dramatic about the all-consuming power of the edit in creating the meaning of film, the ability to erase the actor, but only a little bit. This quirk of our brains, this perception of continuity and relation between two disconnected images, is second only to the perception of motion itself in how fundamental it is to the very structure of cinema.
Okay. So there you go. There's a really good overview of the Kuleshov effect. Now I'm just going to try find if I've got the original here for you. If not, let's go back to the PowerPoint slide and let's watch it. This is the original. Okay. So he's looking at a dead girl. The emotion between the two clips together. And a girl resting. The emotion's the same, but it's intended to be different. Getting the same thing with a bowl of soup. Same emotion, but different meaning by having the two clips together. So that's essentially the Kuleshov effect. And that's why I showed you the video previously, because if you were just watching this, you would find it really creepy and probably not so important. There you go. Let's get rid of that. All right. So you can also watch another clip on Hitchcock talking about the Kuleshov effect. But there's another guy we can talk about now. It's Sergei Eisenstein, a theorist of montage or intellectual montage. And he made the battleship Potemkin strike in October. And I've got some links there for you as well. And another one is Podovkin, Storm Over Asia, and I've got a link for you there. And Dziga Vertov, okay, documentary newsreel tradition, the Kino Privada, which means the eye is the main sensory organ which represents a camera and it tells the story. You can look at those clips as well. So I'm not going to do it for you now. You can just link on all these and find them for yourself. There is one other video though I'd like to show you, which is an overview, a crash course on the Soviet school, which is an excellent overview, and I'll play that for you in a second. But we'll just go through this. Actually, what I'll do is I'll go to our course and just show you a few things about. Okay, so if we go into our unit content, go into intellectual montage, and as you can see next to it is continuity editing. Now, we assume that you understand the principles of editing in nonlinear programs, but if not, there's lots of information here for you. So this is the basic, so the tutorial is the basic principles of editing. Okay, there's some readings there as well for you as well, Martha Mollinson. But the tutorials go into detail about what type of editing programs we should use. So for the next 2 weeks, we're talking about different types of editing, which is montage and continuity. But the practical side of it is in the tutorials where you can learn how to use Final Cut Pro X, Adobe Premiere Pro, and there's a few other ones as well. Now, I we'll go into some more detail on free sites that are available. And I actually found one recently for you, which I'll load up for you as well. There was 22, whereabouts is it? Here we go. All right, now I'll put this online for you as well. So it's just a 22 best free editing software programs in 2019. So that's the link up there, and I'll pop that up for you as well so you can have a look at it at some stage. But it goes through all the different free programs you can use if you're not on campus. I guess this is especially important for the people online because at the university we have Final Cut Pro X and we also have Adobe Premiere Pro CC, so you can use those programs at uni. But there's lots of free ones that you could use as well. And now one of my students has also recommended DaVinci Resolve, which I've never used, but I'm getting some good feedback on it at the moment. So just go through this site, and if you don't have access to the university, or if you do want to edit on your own computer, that's fine also. So if you've got a Mac, you can use iMovie, which is free. On the Windows, I'm not sure, but you can grab all these ones here. So there's Blender. I've never really heard of it. Lightworks. It used to be just a grading program, color grading, which is like DaVinci. Shotcut, never heard of it, but it looks like it's on a Mac there. But what you can see is the principles are the same. So the interfaces are very similar. So editing is about cutting pieces and putting them into a sequence. And it should be the same for everything. So for instance, this one here, that's your browser, which has got all your files, and you cut them up into the sequence here and drop them off and put them in there. Now that looks like an old Final Cut Pro X one, or similar sort of interface. But same sort of thing here. This looks like a very simple version. I'm not really sure about this one. Never heard of this one, but as you can see, similar interface to Final Cut Pro X and also Adobe Premiere Pro. Okay, again, we've got a browser window there, which all our files go, a preview window, a play window, and our sequence box where we drop all our files, and that's where all the editing's done. Okay, now this one here, DaVinci Resolve, like I said, I haven't tried it, but apparently it's pretty good. I'm actually going to try it, but I already own a subscription to Adobe Premiere Pro, that's why I use that. And Final Cut Pro is available at the universities, and it's a pretty good program. Just a couple of things so there's plenty there that you can have a look at. But for me, the reason I like using Premiere Pro is because it's a non-linear editing program, which means that I can drop files anywhere. Now, Final Cut Pro is also a non-linear editing program, but they've got this thing called a magnetic timeline, which brings everything to the front of the page, the sequence, and which turns it almost into a linear program, which I don't really like. But if you want to learn Premiere Pro, 20 minutes, there's a link there for you. Final Cut Pro, full class. If you do this, it's an hour and a half, but I guarantee you it'll be an excellent program. Now, this guy's David A. Cox, and he does a really good job, but I use Adobe Premiere Pro mainly. Okay, now you can look at all these things here as well, and there's also a little section here where you can do a little bit of a practice. You download this, and you can cut your own little program to have a little practice with. Now, I highly recommend you bring your own footage so we can do a little bit of work together. And I've actually been working on a couple of commercials lately, so I can show you a little bit of the work I've been doing on that lately. It's for a lawyer. He does criminal law, and I'm doing 4 little TV commercials for different clientele that he's after. So I can show you that at some stage. But so that's the practical side of it. The theoretical side of it is what we just talked about, the Kuleshov effect, the montage editing, and next week we're going to talk about continuity editing. Okay, so lots of good stuff, lots of good things for you guys to do this week. And as I said, because we missed out on this week because of Anzac Day, I will make time available in the tutes after our initial tutes on Thursday. So from 12 o'clock onwards, I'll be in the studio So the online people can send me some information if they like, and I'll put some clips together there for you, and the on-campus students can hang around afterwards and have a little bit of a play under my guidance as well. Okay, so let's go back to our little Soviet school, and I will show you the video at the end of this on a breakdown, but I'll just go through this for you, and we'll just talk a little bit more about the key protagonists in the Soviet school. So Sergei, it's not Einstein, it's Eisenstein, and he had a theory that that the idea of different shots had different meaning, and ideographs combine logic. So for instance, if you show the bird and the mouth, it equals singing. It's almost like an enthymeme. So for instance, if you have the heart and the knife together, it shows sorrow. So it's similar to Koloshov's experiments, but there are slight differences. We'll talk to you about it again. So he saw haikus doing the same sort of thing. So two different ideas create a final meaning, and there's some examples there for you. So I've got another link here, Sergei's 5 montage methods. So he saw montage as collision and conflict, rather than Kuleshov, who saw it more like adding meaning, adding on overall like brickwork. So building the story rather than collision and conflict all the time. And we'll flick to that in a second. So the important bit here, it's in the mind of the viewer that this conflict occurs. That's why it's called intellectual montage. Okay, it's the mind that creates the montage of images. And as you saw before on that video, montage means putting things together. Okay, so let's click on here and see what link it takes us to.
Hi there. Today we're going to talk about Russian filmmaker and theorist Sergei Eisenstein and his famous methods of montage. Since the word montage has come to mean any edited sequence, it's important to note that while all montage contains editing, not all editing is true montage with a capital M. If the cut simply shows us another physical angle of the scene, coverage as it is commonly known, this is not montage in the Soviet sense of the word. According to Eisenstein, montage was combining shots that are depictive, single in meaning, neutral in content, into intellectual contexts and series. In other words, two neutral images colliding to illustrate a third, undepictable thing.
There's the Kuleshov
So now that we
effect.
have a basic understanding of what montage is, and isn't, let's dive into Eisenstein's 5 methods. Metric montage is cutting according to an exact measured meter or length of time, irregardless of the content of the shot itself. Eisenstein cites the patriotic demonstrations from the end of St. Petersburg as an example of metric montage. Here the cuts are made irregardless of their individual content, but rather to create a sense of chaos amid the gunfire and explosions. Another utilization of metric montage is in ratcheting up tension by shortening the pieces while preserving the original proportions of the formation. Also referred to as continuity editing, rhythmic montage is the easiest to spot and most widely used method of montage. Everything from car chases to dialogue scenes utilize rhythmic montage.
Non-animal jokes.
Well, I only got the chance to say one because we only did one show.
In rhythmic montage, each shot's practical length derives from the specifics of the piece and from its planned length according to the structure of the sequence. The Odessa Steppes sequence from Eisenstein's own battleship Potemkin is a prime and most frequently cited example of rhythmic montage, and indeed has been homaged and parodied many times throughout the years. Now, montage methods are not mutually exclusive, and metric and rhythmic elements are certainly found within our next 2 methods. Tonal montage is based on the characteristic emotional sound of the piece. That's great, Sergei, but what exactly does it mean? Well, think of tone in this sense as any visual or oral characteristic that 2 different shots could share in common. An example from the more recent The Revenant perfectly illustrates not just one, but several instances of tonal montage in sequence. In the following edits, it is a motif of fogginess or haze that unifies the shots. There are other tonalities you can use as the basis for your montage as well. Wong Kar-wai uses graphical or compositional tonality as a basis for montage in his acclaimed In the Mood for Love, as both main characters are discovered at their writing desks, framed within the additional frames of the set architecture, tonally connected to the idea that they are both trapped alone in their circumstances. In these series of shots from Martin Scorsese's The Age of Innocence, light tonality drives the edits. In this cut from Apocalypse Now, oral tonality is utilized. Overtonal is by its nature more abstract and complicated than the methods discussed up until now. As Eisenstein puts it, from the moment that overtones can be heard parallel with the basic sound, there also can be sensed vibrations, oscillations that cease to impress as tones, but rather as purely physical displacements of the perceived impression. One scene famous for cross-cutting and rife with overtonal montage is the baptism sequence from The Godfather Part 1. Many themes, tones, and overtones intermingle in this sequence that treats violence as a holy writ, shows the connection between religion and corruption, and sanctifies the actions of a murderer.
I do renounce them.
Filmmakers like Terrence Malick and David Lynch, famous for their poetic approach to filmmaking, where mood and tone supersede logic and plot, oftentimes rely heavily on overtonal montage. Eisenstein said intellectual montage is montage not of general physiological overtonal sounds, but of sounds and overtones of an intellectual sort. One glaringly obvious example from a well-known film is the cross-cutting of the caribou being slaughtered with Willard killing Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. The famous match cut in 2001: A Space Odyssey, from the bone to the orbital weapon satellite, is another prime example of intellectual montage. So there you have it, folks. Eisenstein's 5 methods of montage, explained and exemplified for your viewing pleasure.
Okay, there you have it. So it was really, really good explanation, and that's why I like to show you how people put those together. So thanks, Ryan, there. Let's go back and have a look where we're at. Okay. So as you can see, music plays a really important part of montage in the way that it can be cut. So it's counterpoint, dominant, modulation, overtones, and multiphonics. So think about that when you're cutting images, and that's why if you, I know we're only doing a TVC class because we're an intro into essential screen skills, but as you progress and if you want to do more videos in regards to music, considering Southern Cross Uni has a very good music program, these are the sort of editing techniques you could use if you're making music videos. So there's a sequence there in the Odessa Steps, which you saw before, and there's a link there. I probably won't link it on, we won't go to it at the moment, but you can click on there, and I think I've actually linked it to the whole I'll just see where I've linked it, but I think it goes to the whole program.
Monday.com is a team management tool that changed my life, because my day used to be wasted on marketing meetings. Carefully reminding just
the ads, of course. Oh, okay, so it's just the steps here. You can have a look at that in your own time, so I don't drive you nuts. But there's the links to the steps there, and further on I've actually got the whole Battleship Potemkin for you to view if you like, if that's what interests you. And here's a couple of clips from it, or different shots. And I've also got Storm Over Asia there for you, and there's a link there as well. Intellectual montage and rhythm conflict, and you can watch the whole thing there as well. Now let's have a look at Podovkin's, where some of his principles clearly overlap. It's 9 minutes, so I might not play the whole thing for you.
So I have a lot of editing to do this month. So let's talk about editing.
I'll just play.
Hello there, my name is Colin, and welcome back to the Filmmaker Files. The past couple episodes, we've done a little bit more on set, behind the scenes, more on the technical side of how to do things. And while I think that's great and I want to continue to do those, I know that there are definitely other YouTube channels out there that have covered a lot of that kind of stuff before. And while I want to continue to do that kind of stuff, one of the biggest things that I've been looking forward to doing with the Filmmaker Files is diving into some of the more abstract ideas, looking at how your framing, lighting, and music and editing can have an emotional impact on an audience. So in order to take a look at the different principles of editing, we got to talk about my main man, Vsevolod Podovkin. Not talked about a lot necessarily unless you actually go to a film school or do some research, but I think he's incredibly interesting, and he definitely had a huge influence when it comes to editing. Podovkin was a Russian filmmaker in the early 20th century. He was a director and an actor, and he even wrote a book called Film Technique and Film Acting. But like I said earlier, one of the biggest fields that he had an impact in was editing. Podovkin has a great quote, which is, "The foundation of film art is editing." Now, Podovkin was pretty ahead of his time, noting that the way that you lay out your shots next to each other in the editing process can have a really big emotional impact on your audience. It wasn't about just taking you from one place to the next, to the next, to the next to progress the story, which he called structural editing. But the editing process was also about directing the emotions of your audience, which he called relational editing. So from that, he got his 5 principles of editing: contrast, parallelism, symbolism, simultaneity, and leitmotif. Now, there are plenty of essays that you can check out there that list off famous examples of each one of these principles, and I'm going to be mentioning them myself. But I also just want to take a movie. I'm going to take the film Interstellar and just show you how you can look for each one of these things in any film you watch. So let's start off with contrast. Contrast is pretty straightforward. It's taking 2 different things, putting them next to each other, and really highlighting the differences between them. This can be done with a cut, or it can be done with a montage. A couple famous examples of this would be the baptism scene at the end of The Godfather, when Michael Corleone is getting baptized and he's renouncing Satan. He is also having his men carry out hits on a bunch of people all around the city. Another famous example would be in 2001 Space Odyssey, when the ape throws the bone up into the air and it cuts to a spaceship, although in a minute we're going to argue how that could also be parallelism, but it shows a pretty big contrast in terms of technology with the ape and the technology of mankind in the future. Now we'll take a look at Interstellar. In the opening scene of the film, Cooper is having a nightmare about one of his test flights going wrong and spinning out of control. Then we cut to him in the safety of his own bed down on Earth. Next up is parallelism, which is really just the opposite of contrast. You're taking 2 different things and putting them next to each other to show the similarities between the 2. This can also be a great technique to take your audience from one place to another or through time in a creative way that doesn't just have a title card thrown over it. So going back to 2001 Space Odyssey with the bone being thrown up in the air and then cutting to the spaceship, you could definitely argue that this cut is a parallel instead of a contrast, taking 2 different tools, one very early on in man's existence and one much later in the future. You could also note that they're very similar in shape and size, so I think it's interesting that you can look at it from 2 different ways. Another pretty famous example is in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, when the treasure hunter puts the hat on young Indy, and then we cut forward to him years later as the more Harrison Fordy version of Indiana Jones that we know.
Get off my plane.
Not only is this a great way of taking us forward in time and in the story, it's also a really nice way to show us a comparison between who he was and who he is and how similar they are. So now we jump over to Interstellar, and one of my favorite sequences in the film, when Cooper is driving away from his family farm. We see different shots mounted on the vehicle and of him as he drives off, and then we cut forward as the countdown ends to the rockets igniting and him beginning to take off, and it really just drives home that idea that he's going on this adventure and that he is in control of those decisions that he made to leave his family, and he's like a pilot driving, so similarities. I'll give another example of parallelism in Interstellar, also one of my favorite scenes in the film, which is when Cooper is sitting watching his now grown-up daughter sending a video recording to him. As her video recording ends, we then cut to her ending the recording. Not only is this a great transition from one scene and one character to another, but it really highlights the similarities of the journeys that the two characters are taking. Next up, we have symbolism, that is taking two somewhat seemingly unrelated shots and putting them side by side to really show the similarities between the two. Very similar to parallelism, but this is a lot more symbolic, hence the name, symbolism. Definitely the most famous example of this, and probably one of the most famous film edits in history, would be the match cut in Lawrence of Arabia. In the scene leading up to this cut, we have Lawrence talking to another officer about wanting to go to the desert, and the officer telling him about how hot and formidable the desert is, to him then blowing out a match, and then we're suddenly transported to the desert. Now we jump over to Interstellar, and what's actually a very, very similar scenario and edit. We have a scene between Cooper and Romley as Romley expresses his anxiety about the fact that there's very little keeping them from certain death. Cooper then tells him about how many of the best yachtsmen don't actually know how to swim, and then he hands him a recording of sounds of Earth. As these sounds are playing, we then have a cut of them floating through space past Saturn. This does a great job of really underscoring his fears and taking those and putting them on the audience as well. Next up, we have simultaneity. This is probably the easiest one to spot and definitely a favorite of Hollywood action films. When you take two scenes that are going on at the same time and you cut back and forth between the two. When you're intercutting those scenes, it's a great way to keep up the pacing and build up tension. When you get to a point where there's really nothing going on in one scene, you jump over to another scene, play that one out, jump back and forth until either they meet up or they both meet their conclusions. Terrific example of this is in Silence of the Lambs. As the SWAT team is preparing to close in on Buffalo Bill's house, we then cut over to Buffalo Bill, back and forth, as we think that we're leading up to the SWAT team busting in on him, and then it's all revealed that that's actually not the case, and that Clarice is showing up to his house and that they're at the wrong place. This is not just great for building up tension in that scene, but then it completely sets up the tension for what's to come because it's still not resolved. Moving back to Interstellar now, we have a scene where Mann and Cooper are fighting on that awesome ice planet, intercut with the scene where Murph is trying to get her brother and his family out of that house. The tension builds between the two arguments and fighting. Now we move on to leitmotif, which is usually a term for music. It is a repetition of theme. A very famous example is the point of view shot in Jaws. Every time you see that shot, you know exactly what's coming next. Now moving over to Interstellar, there was one really interesting shot and theme that really kept reappearing, and that was camera shots mounted on vehicles. We see a shot of that in the truck, and definitely plenty of shots of that on the smaller Ranger spacecraft. And every time we see that, we know that we're heading into an adventure and danger and the unknown. One of the things I think is really cool about understanding these principles is that they don't just inform you as an editor, they inform you in just about every other capacity of filmmaking. As a writer or director, it's important to know these because it really helps you elevate just telling facts to your audience and finding more clever ways to really relate ideas and emotions and transferring people from place to place. As a cinematographer too, it's really great for establishing themes and from taking people from one shot to the next and conveying a lot of emotion without any dialogue. So that's where we're going to leave things today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this video, definitely drop it a like, maybe subscribe if you feel compelled to do so, and of course I would love to hear your thoughts and other examples of each one of these in different films down in the comments below. I'm Colin, and I'll see you guys next week.
Okay, so that was another really good overview. And he pointed out there right at the end, it's really about taking people on a journey without having to spell it out. It's about implying meaning, and that's what we're actually trying to do, rather than just like, we're trying to move people rather than just educate them and get them to read something. So by using all this type of montage, we're trying to create meaning visually. And music video and experimental film really take all this into in their stride, where the focus on the edit is paramount. So using all this sort of stuff, sound relations, juxtaposition, the language of music, speed, texture, tonality, density, all this sort of stuff is used in the way that you edit to create meaning in a non-continuity way. So by adding pictures together and types of pictures together, you're creating a complete different visual language for your audience to enjoy. Okay, so that's all we have for this week. But what I will do is I'll just get you onto this another YouTube clip. I'll just find this YouTube clip for you quickly, and it's Soviet montage crash course. Which is really good fun. It's only about 12 minutes. I'm just going to have it here for you quickly. I'll just punch that into your YouTube thing.
The Russian Revolution marked the first...
So this basically is a reiteration of what we just went through, but in a fun, humorous way, and it goes through a few different little examples for you, which is quite fun. So if this is what you're interested in, montage editing, it's actually quite a nice little video to watch. Okay, so I'll try to link this clip for you as well, but if not, just go to Soviet Montage Crash Course and we'll give you a link to it. But lots of good fun, and rather than playing it for you here, you can just grab it in your own time and go from there. Alright, thanks guys. I'll see you next Thursday, everybody, and online for the online students.